Content warning. This episode discusses real historical events involving violence, loss of life, and religious persecution during Ireland's turbulent independence period. We present this story with deep respect for the victims and their families. Viewer discretion is advised. Welcome to this journey through one of the most suppressed tragedies in Irish history, a massacre that occurred not on a battlefield, but within the sacred walls of a rural convent. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you thought you knew about Ireland's fight for independence in a way few other accounts can't. We're about to delve into a mystery that the Irish government buried for nearly a century, where 13 Carmelite nuns defied the violent currents of civil war and left a legacy so disturbing that church records were sealed. Witness testimonies vanished, and entire newspaper archives were systematically destroyed. What happened in that convent wasn't just murder, it was erasure. It was the year 1923. The Irish Civil War was tearing the newly independent nation apart, brother fighting brother over a treaty that promised freedom but delivered partition. Across Europe, the world was still recovering from the Great War's devastation, but in Ireland, the violence had only transformed, no longer against British occupation, but against itself. In County Cork, in the remote townland of Ballyvourney, the situation was particularly brutal. This was IRA territory where old scores were settled in the dark, where informers were found face down in bogs, where the line between patriot and terrorist had become so blurred that even God seemed to have abandoned the green hills. But this story doesn't begin in 1923. To understand what happened in that convent, we must first understand the land itself, the ancient mystical landscape of West Cork, where Irish had been spoken for 1,000 years before English ever echoed through the valleys. We must understand the weight of history that pressed down on every soul living there. The generations of occupation, famine, eviction, and rebellion that had soaked the soil with blood and tears. Ballyvourney sits in the Massacre Mountains, a place where mist clings to everything like a living thing, where the hills rise dark and forbidding against perpetually gray skies, where stone walls older than memory divide fields that have known more death than harvest. The river Slane cuts through the valley, its waters cold and brown with peat, its banks lined with ancient oak trees that lean inward as if sharing secrets the living shouldn't hear. This was a land of whispers, whispers of the old ways, of fairy forts and holy wells, of St. Gobnate, who had founded a community here in the 6th century, whispers of more recent horrors, the black and tans burning farmhouses, the auxiliaries dragging young men from their beds, the screams that echoed through the night and were never explained in the morning. By 1923, Ireland had won its war against Britain, but the victory was hollow. The Anglo-Irish Treaty had created the Irish Free State, but it had also abandoned the 6 counties of the north, and it had required an oath of allegiance to the British Crown that many Republicans found intolerable. The nation fractured. Those who accepted the treaty, the Free State forces, fought those who rejected it, the irregulars, the anti-treaty IRA. In Ballyvourney, there was no neutrality. The convent of Our Lady of Sorrows stood on a hillside overlooking the town, a gray stone structure built in 1867 when the Catholic Church was reasserting itself after centuries of British penal laws. It was home to 13 Carmelite nuns, an enclosed order, women who had taken vows of silence and contemplation, who prayed behind grilled windows and heavy doors, who had removed themselves from the world's violence to devote their lives to God, or so everyone believed. The Mother Superior was Sister Mary Columbanus, born Margaret O'Brien in 1875 to a prosperous farming family near Macroom. She had entered the convent at age 19, driven by what she described in her letters as a terrible calling, a voice that would not let me rest until I surrendered everything to God's service. She was known throughout the region as a woman of fierce devotion and even fiercer will, a woman who ran the convent with absolute authority, who demanded perfection in prayer and penance, who saw the world outside the convent walls as a corrupting force that threatened the purity of her community. The other 12 nuns ranged in age from 23 to 67. Most came from local families, daughters of farmers and shopkeepers who had sent their girls to the religious life, partly from devotion, partly from economic necessity. In those days, a dowry was required to marry, and for families with many daughters, The convent was a respectable alternative to poverty or emigration. Sister Bernadette, the youngest, had been born Bridget Moynihan in Ballyvorney itself. She had entered the convent in 1920, just as the War of Independence was reaching its climax. Her brother, Tom Moynihan, was a prominent IRA commander, a man whose name was spoken in hushed tones, a man who had burned a police barracks, who had ambushed a military convoy, who had tortured suspected informers until they confessed to crimes real and imagined. This connection between the convent and the IRA would prove fatal. The civil war that erupted in June 1922 was particularly vicious in Cork. The city changed hands multiple times. Free State soldiers executed Republican prisoners in reprisal killings. Irregulars assassinated Free State officers in their homes. The countryside became a patchwork of shifting allegiances, where a village that was Republican on Monday might be occupied by Free State troops by Wednesday, where yesterday's comrade was today's enemy. In this chaos, convents and churches were supposed to be sanctuaries, neutral ground where even the most hardened fighters would not tread, but nothing is truly neutral in a civil war. Throughout 1922 and into early 1923, rumors began to circulate about the convent of Our Lady of Sorrows. Travelers passing through Ballyvorney reported unusual activity, men coming and going after dark, lights in windows that should have been dark, the sound of voices and movement that seemed inconsistent with a contemplative religious community. The Free State authorities took note. Captain Daniel Hegarty of the National Army had been assigned to Cork in January 1923 with explicit orders to root out the remaining irregular strongholds. He was 31 years old, a veteran of the War of Independence who had sided with the treaty, believing that pragmatic compromise was better than endless bloodshed. He was a pragmatist, not an ideologue, a man who followed orders but struggled with the moral complexities of fighting former comrades. In his diary, discovered decades later in a Dublin archive, Hegarty wrote, "Cork is a nightmare. We are hunting ghosts who know every stone and tree, who have cousins in every cottage, who disappear into the hills and reappear behind our lines. The people hate us more than they ever hated the British, because we are their own sons turned against them. I dream of going home to Clare, of never hearing a gunshot again, but the orders keep coming and I keep obeying because what else is there?" On February 12, 1923, Hegarty received intelligence that would set everything in motion. A Free State informer, a local man, whose identity was never officially recorded but who was known by the code name Blackbird, reported that the convent of Our Lady of Sorrows was being used as an arms cache and safe house for irregular forces. According to Blackbird, Tom Moynihan himself was using his sister's convent to store weapons, hide fugitives, and plan operations against Free State positions. Hegarty was skeptical. Raiding a convent was politically and religiously dangerous. The Catholic Church hierarchy had reluctantly sided with the Free State, but attacking nuns would turn public opinion toxic. Yet the intelligence was specific. Blackbird claimed that a large shipment of rifles and ammunition, stolen from a National Army depot in Killarney, was hidden in the convent's crypt. Hegarty requested permission from his superiors in Dublin. The response took 5 days. When it came, it was unequivocal. Investigate the convent, but proceed with extreme caution. No publicity, no unnecessary force. If the intelligence proved false, apologize and withdraw. If it proved true, arrest anyone involved and confiscate the weapons, but treat the nuns with respect. On February 19, 1923, Hegarty led a small detachment, 12 soldiers, all handpicked for their discipline and discretion, to Ballyvorney. They arrived just after dawn, when the mist was still thick on the ground, when the world was gray and indistinct, when sound carried strangely through the valley. The convent loomed above them, its stone walls dark with moisture, its narrow windows like the empty eye sockets of a skull. No smoke rose from the chimneys, though the morning was bitterly cold. No lights showed in any window. The building appeared utterly lifeless, abandoned, a tomb rather than a home. Hegarty approached the heavy wooden door and knocked. The sound echoed inside, hollow and resonant. No response. He knocked again, harder this time, the rhythmic pounding seeming to disturb the very air, sending crows scattering from the surrounding trees with harsh, accusatory cries. Still nothing. One of his soldiers, a young man named Patrick Lynch from Tipperary, whispered, "Captain, something's wrong." There should be movement, noise, something. It's too quiet. Hegarty felt it too, a wrongness that went beyond the absence of sound. The silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating, oppressive, pregnant with dread. He tried the door. It was unlocked. As it swung inward, the smell hit them first. Not the expected scent of incense and candle wax, but something else, something copper-sweet and putrid, something that made Lynch gag and step backward, his hand flying to his mouth. "Jesus Christ," someone whispered. The entrance hall was dark, lit only by the gray dawn light filtering through narrow windows. The stone floor was wet, not with water, but with something darker, something that had pooled and congealed, something that their boots stuck to as they stepped inside. Blood, massive quantities of blood. Hegarty drew his revolver. Behind him, his soldiers readied their rifles. Though their hands trembled, though some of them were praying under their breath, though all of them wanted to turn and run from whatever horror waited in the darkness ahead. "Spread out," Hegarty ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Check every room. Call out if you find anyone alive." They moved through the convent like men walking through a nightmare. The chapel was first. The door stood open, and inside, the dawn light falling through stained glass windows created patterns of red and blue on walls that were already stained, splattered with blood that had dried in long streaks, handprints frozen in their desperate upward reach, testimony to violence so sudden and overwhelming that there had been no time for anything but panic. 6 bodies lay before the altar, 6 nuns, their habits soaked black with blood, their hands still clasped in prayer, their faces. Lynch vomited in the corner. Another soldier, McCarthy, sank to his knees and began to sob. Hegarty forced himself to look, to catalog, to remain functional even as his mind recoiled from what his eyes were seeing. The nuns had been shot at close range, multiple times. The wounds were not the clean holes of military execution, but the massive, destructive injuries of repeated fire, of rage unleashed, of something beyond mere killing. But worse than the violence was the staging. The bodies had been arranged, deliberately positioned, 3 kneeling before the altar, 3 lying prostrate behind them, all facing east, all with rosary beads wrapped around their hands, all composed in postures of worship even as their faces spoke of terror. This was not combat. This was ritual. "Captain," a voice called from deeper in the building, "you need to see this." Hegarty left the chapel on legs that felt disconnected from his body, following the voice to the refectory, the dining hall where the nuns would have taken their simple meals in silence. 5 more bodies. 5 more nuns seated at the long wooden table, bowls of congealed porridge before them, spoons still clutched in dead hands. They had been shot while eating breakfast, their blood mixing with their morning meal. Their lives ended mid-prayer of gratitude. The killer or killers had waited until they were all seated, all vulnerable, all trusting in the sanctity of their routine. "Mother of God," Hegarty breathed. "Who could do this?" The final 2 bodies were found in the dormitory in separate cells. Sister Mary Columbanus, the Mother Superior, lay in her narrow bed, her hands folded on her chest, a single bullet wound in her forehead. Her eyes were still open, staring at the ceiling with an expression that Hegarty would see in his nightmares for the rest of his life. Not fear, not surprise, but something worse. Recognition. She had known her killer, the 13th nun. Sister Bernadette, Tom Moynihan's sister, was found in her cell with a revolver in her hand and a bullet wound in her temple. At first glance it appeared to be suicide, but the angle was wrong, the powder burns inconsistent. Someone had placed the gun in her hand after death, staging the scene to suggest she had killed herself, perhaps in guilt or madness. But why stage anything? If this was an irregular attack on collaborators, why make it look like something else?
If this was Free State retribution, why hide it?
Hegarty's men searched the entire convent. They found the crypt that Blackbird had mentioned. It contained no weapons, no ammunition, no evidence of IRA activity. Instead, they found ordinary things: old furniture, stored food, religious vestments, boxes of candles and sacramental wine. Nothing that would justify a raid, let alone a massacre. In the Mother Superior's office, Hegarty discovered her diary, a leather-bound book filled with meticulous daily entries dating back years. He began reading by candlelight, searching for anything that might explain what had happened. The early entries were mundane. Prayers scheduled, supplies ordered, minor disputes between sisters resolved. But as Hegarty read forward through 1922 and into 1923, a disturbing pattern emerged. October 15th, 1922. Thomas M. came again tonight. I told him we cannot continue to provide shelter. This is God's house, not a barracks. He became angry, said I owed allegiance to Ireland before allegiance to any treaty. I reminded him that I owe allegiance only to God. He left without blessing. November 3rd, 1922. Men came with boxes after midnight. Sister B let them in. I confronted her. She says they are her brother's men, that we must help the cause. I said there is no cause worth defiling this sacred space. She wept, but would not promise to refuse them again. December 12th, 1922. The Free State soldiers are increasing patrols. Father Donnelly warned me that we are being watched, that rumors are spreading. I have prayed for guidance but receive only silence. What should I do when my own sister in Christ conspires against the peace I have tried to maintain? January 8th, 1923. I have written to the bishop requesting his intervention. Thomas M. and his men are using us, putting all the sisters at risk. Sister B is torn between family loyalty and religious vows. I fear this will end badly. January 30th, 1923. The bishop has not responded. Perhaps he fears choosing sides. Meanwhile, weapons are being stored in the chapel itself, hidden behind the altar. Every time I enter to pray, I am confronted by these instruments of death. This is desecration. I have decided I must act, even if it means betraying Sister B's family. The final entry was dated February 11th, 1923, one day before Blackbird's intelligence reached Hegarty. I have sent word to the authorities. May God forgive me, but I see no other path. The guns must be removed, the men must be stopped, and if Sister B must face earthly justice for her part in this, then so be it. I would rather betray family than betray God, but I am afraid. Thomas M. is a hard man, a violent man, and I have seen what he does to informers. I have confessed my intention to Father Donnelly. He advised me to flee, to go to Cork City where I would be under the bishop's protection. But I cannot abandon my sisters. This is my convent, my responsibility. Whatever comes, I will face it here. Hegarty closed the diary, his hands shaking. The Mother Superior had been the informer. She had contacted the Free State authorities about the weapons cache, but somehow, through some leak, some indiscretion, some betrayal within Hegarty's own chain of command, Tom Moynihan had learned of her betrayal before the raid could occur, and he had come for revenge. But if Moynihan had removed the weapons before the raid, why kill everyone? Why not just relocate the arms and disappear? Why massacre 13 innocent women, including his own sister? The answer lay in the convent's crypt. Hegarty returned to the crypt with Lynch and 2 other soldiers. This time they searched more carefully, moving boxes, checking walls, probing the stone floor for hollow spaces. It was Lynch who found it, a loose flagstone in the far corner, beneath a wooden shelf that held communion wafers and wine. When they pried it up, they discovered a chamber beneath, roughly 6 feet by 6 feet, carved into the bedrock. Inside were bodies, not nuns. Men, 5 men in various states of decomposition, some relatively fresh, some reduced to skeletal remains dressed in tattered clothing. All showed signs of violent death, bullet wounds, knife wounds, blunt force trauma. All had been bound at the wrists and ankles before being killed. These were not IRA volunteers. These were prisoners, men who had been interrogated, tortured, and executed, their bodies hidden beneath the convent that was supposed to be a sanctuary. Among the bodies, Hegarty found identification papers. One man had been a Free State soldier reported missing 3 months earlier. Another had been a local shopkeeper suspected of being a Free State informer. A third had been a Protestant farmer who had sold land to a pro-treaty family. Tom Moynihan hadn't just been using the convent as a weapons cache. He had been using it as an execution site, a place where his enemies could be disappeared without trace, where the sanctity of the location would prevent searches, where his own sister's vows of silence would keep the secret, and Mother Superior Mary Columbanus had discovered it. That was the real betrayal, not reporting the weapons, but threatening to expose the murder chamber, the mass grave, the evidence of war crimes that would have destroyed Moynihan's reputation even among his own anti-treaty forces. Men might forgive raiding military depots or ambushing soldiers, but torturing prisoners and hiding their bodies under a convent, That was beyond the pale, even in civil war. So Moynihan had made a terrible calculation. He had sacrificed everyone, all 13 nuns, including his own sister, to eliminate the witnesses and create a mystery so horrifying that the truth would be buried under layers of confusion, conspiracy theories, and institutional cover-up. Hegarty immediately sent word to his superiors in Cork and Dublin. He expected a full investigation, public trials, justice for the murdered nuns and the bodies in the crypt. What he got instead was silence. On February 21, 1923, 2 days after the discovery, high-ranking officers arrived from Dublin with explicit orders. The Convent massacre was to be classified as a military matter under emergency powers. No public statements would be made. No newspaper coverage would be permitted. The bodies would be buried quickly and quietly. All evidence would be sealed. All witnesses, including Hegarty and his men, would be sworn to secrecy under threat of court-martial. The official story, released weeks later in a brief newspaper notice, stated that the Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows had been damaged by fire of unknown origin, and that the nuns had been relocated to other communities. No mention of deaths. No mention of murder. No mention of the truth. Why the cover-up? The answer lay in the brutal politics of 1923 Ireland. The Free State government was desperately trying to establish legitimacy, both domestically and internationally. The Catholic Church's support was crucial. The bishops had reluctantly backed the treaty, providing moral authority to the new government. But that support was fragile, conditional on the Free State proving itself a defender of Catholic values and institutions. A massacre in a convent, even if committed by anti-treaty forces, would have been catastrophic for public relations. It would have raised questions about the Free State's ability to protect the Church. It would have reignited debates about the violence of the Civil War. It would have given ammunition to the Republicans who argued that the Free State was illegitimate, that the treaty had brought only chaos and bloodshed. Moreover, there was the problem of Tom Moynihan himself. Moynihan was not just any IRA commander. He was a symbol of the resistance, a folk hero in Republican mythology, a man whose exploits against the British had inspired ballads and stories. Even among Free State supporters, there was grudging respect for his courage and military skill. If the truth about the convent came out, if the public learned that this celebrated patriot had turned a holy place into a torture chamber, that he had murdered 13 nuns including his own sister, the resulting scandal would have tainted not just Moynihan, but the entire independence struggle. It would have been weaponized by British commentators to argue that the Irish were incapable of self-governance, that they were barbaric and uncivilized, that home rule had been a mistake, so the truth was suppressed, buried, erased. Hegarty protested to his superiors. He wrote letters to the Bishop of Cork, to members of the Free State Parliament, to newspaper editors. All his correspondence was intercepted, confiscated, destroyed. In March 1923, he was quietly transferred to a remote garrison in Donegal. In June, he was discharged from the army on medical grounds, nervous exhaustion, the paperwork said. Though he was perfectly healthy, he spent the rest of his life trying to tell the story. He wrote to historians, to priests, to anyone who would listen. But without evidence, all the photographs, documents, and physical evidence had been seized by the government. He was dismissed as a madman, a man traumatized by war who had invented a lurid fantasy to make sense of his trauma. His diary, the one that contained his contemporary account of the massacre, disappeared from his possession in 1925. It would not resurface until 1998, discovered in a sealed government archive by a researcher working on an unrelated project. By then, Hegarty had been dead for 30 years, his reputation destroyed, his testimony buried under decades of official denial. But what of Tom Moynihan? What happened to the man who committed the massacre? The answer reveals just how far the cover-up extended. Moynihan continued fighting against the Free State throughout 1923. He was never captured, never prosecuted for any crimes. When the Civil War officially ended in May 1923, with the Republican forces defeated and dispersed, Moynihan went underground. He lived under various aliases, moving between safe houses in Cork and Kerry, protected by a network of supporters who either didn't know or didn't care about what he had done. In 1926, a political amnesty was declared. Moynihan emerged from hiding and resumed a normal life. He married, had children, ran a successful farming business near Macroom. He became a respected member of the community, a man who spoke at commemorations for fallen IRA volunteers, who was interviewed by local historians about his experiences in the independence struggle. He never faced justice. He died in 1967, age 73, surrounded by loving family, mourned as a patriot and hero. His obituary in the Cork Examiner praised his unwavering commitment to Irish freedom and his courageous resistance against oppression. There was no mention of the Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows, no mention of 13 murdered nuns, no mention of the torture chamber beneath the altar. The erasure was complete, but erasure is never total. Memory persists, even when officially suppressed. The truth leaks out in fragments, in whispered conversations, in deathbed confessions, in documents that escape destruction. In the years and decades after 1923, stories circulated around Ballyvorney. The locals knew something had happened at the convent. They had seen the soldiers, the covered wagons removing bodies, the sudden abandonment of a building that had been central to community life. The official story about a fire and relocation satisfied no one. But in the atmosphere of fear and suspicion that pervaded post-Civil War Ireland, few dared to ask questions too loudly. Some families quietly removed their daughters from other convents, fearing that the violence might spread. Some priests delivered coded sermons about martyrdom and sacrifice, about the difference between righteous resistance and unholy vengeance. Some old women, the kind who kept the oral traditions alive, added a new story to their repertoire, a tale of 13 nuns who had died protecting a holy secret, who had been murdered by men who had forgotten God's law, whose spirits still walked the hillside above Ballyvorney on moonless nights. The Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows was never rebuilt. The building stood empty for years, slowly deteriorating, its roof collapsing, its walls crumbling, nature reclaiming what man had abandoned. Eventually, in the 1950s, it was demolished. A housing estate was built on the site. The new residents reported nothing unusual. No ghosts, no strange sounds, no sense of the tragedy that had occurred there. But in the local cemetery, in a corner that receives little sun, there is a mass grave marked only with a simple stone cross. The inscription reads, "In memory of the Sisters of Our Lady of Sorrows, 1923, Requiem Aeternam, eternal rest." No names, no details, just the year and a prayer. For 75 years, that was all that acknowledged the massacre. Then, in 1998, the discovery of Daniel Hegarty's diary changed everything. The researcher who found it, Dr. Siobhan O'Malley of University College Cork, immediately recognized its historical significance. She spent 2 years verifying Hegarty's account, cross-referencing it with other sources, tracking down descendants of the soldiers who had been with him that day. Some of those descendants still had letters, photographs, fragments of memory passed down through generations despite the official silence. In 2000, Dr. O'Malley published her findings in a respected historical journal. The article, "The Ballyvorney Massacre, State Violence and Institutional Cover-Up in the Irish Civil War," presented overwhelming evidence that 13 nuns had been murdered, that the government had suppressed the truth, that one of Ireland's celebrated independence heroes had been responsible. The response was explosive. The Irish government initially denied everything, claiming the diary was a forgery, the evidence unreliable. But as more documentation surfaced, including sealed church records that confirmed the deaths and burial of 13 nuns from Our Lady of Sorrows in 1923, the denials became untenable. In 2003, the Irish Parliament established a special commission to investigate the massacre and the subsequent cover-up. The commission's work was thorough and damning. It confirmed that Tom Moynihan had indeed murdered the nuns to conceal his use of the convent as an execution site. It confirmed that the Free State government had deliberately suppressed the truth for political reasons. It confirmed that the Catholic Church hierarchy had been complicit in the cover-up, prioritizing institutional protection over justice for the victims. The commission recommended official apologies, compensation for the victims' families, and the establishment of a memorial. In 2005, the Irish Taoiseach delivered a formal apology in the Dáil, acknowledging the grave injustice done to the murdered nuns and the moral failure of successive governments that had kept the truth hidden. In 2007, a memorial was erected on the site of the demolished convent, a circular stone wall with 13 openings, each containing a plaque with the name and brief biography of one of the murdered sisters. At the center stands a bronze sculpture of a woman in nun's habit, her arms outstretched, her face turned skyward, her expression one of simultaneous anguish and grace. The memorial is maintained by a small foundation established by descendants of the victims. They organize an annual commemoration every February 19th, attended by local residents, historians, and occasionally by government officials who come to lay wreaths and make speeches about never forgetting, about learning from history, about the importance of truth. But even now, questions remain. Not everyone accepts the official narrative that has emerged from the Commission's work. Some historians argue that the evidence against Tom Moynihan, while compelling, is not definitive, that Hegarty's diary, though apparently authentic, represents only one perspective, colored by his own biases and the trauma of discovery. They point out that Moynihan was never formally charged, never given the opportunity to defend himself, that condemning him based on posthumous investigation raises troubling questions about historical justice. Others suggest that the massacre might have been carried out not by Moynihan personally, but by rogue elements within the anti-treaty forces, men who had become brutalized by years of violence, who had lost their moral compass, who acted without orders or authorization. In this interpretation, Moynihan bears responsibility for creating the conditions that made the massacre possible, but might not have pulled the trigger himself. Still, others whisper about darker possibilities. Some local historians, drawing on oral traditions and fragmentary evidence, suggest that the truth is even more disturbing than the official account, that the Free State forces themselves might have carried out the massacre, either as a false flag operation to discredit the Republicans or as retaliation for some other incident, and that the cover-up was designed not to protect political sensibilities, but to conceal state-sponsored murder. These theories remain speculative, unproven, sustained more by distrust of official narratives than by concrete evidence. But their persistence speaks to something important: the difficulty of establishing truth after decades of deliberate erasure, the way that silence and suppression create spaces where conspiracy and speculation can flourish. What we know with certainty is this. On February 19, 1923, 13 nuns were murdered in a convent in County Cork. Their deaths were hidden by the Irish government and the Catholic Church for 75 years. The man most likely responsible died peacefully, honored as a hero. The man who tried to expose the truth, Captain Daniel Hegarty, was silenced and discredited. Generations of Irish people grew up never knowing that this massacre had occurred, never questioning the sanitized narratives of the independence struggle. The Ballyvourney massacre reveals uncomfortable truths about national mythology. Ireland's independence story is overwhelmingly told as a heroic narrative: brave patriots fighting against colonial oppression, suffering and sacrifice leading to freedom, a small nation asserting its right to self-determination. This narrative isn't false, but it's incomplete. It erases the violence that Irishmen inflicted on other Irishmen, the moral compromises made in pursuit of political goals, the innocent people caught in the crossfire of competing visions of nationhood. The massacre also reveals the danger of institutional self-protection. Both the government and the church prioritized their own reputations and stability over justice for victims. They calculated that the truth would be more damaging than the lie, that maintaining public confidence required suppressing uncomfortable facts. This calculation was made by individuals who probably considered themselves moral, responsible leaders, people who convinced themselves that the greater good justified the smaller evil of silence. But silence is never small. It compounds. It metastasizes. The decision to cover up the Ballyvourney massacre in 1923 didn't just hide that single crime. It established a pattern, a precedent, an institutional culture of prioritizing image over integrity. The same logic that justified suppressing news of the massacre would later justify covering up clerical abuse, industrial school atrocities, Magdalen laundries, and countless other scandals that would eventually tear through Irish society in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Every cover-up plants seeds of future betrayals. Today, the hillside above Ballyvourney, where the convent once stood, is peaceful. Sheep graze on the slopes. Tourists occasionally stop to photograph the memorial, to read the plaques, to wonder at the story. The Selane River still flows cold and brown through the valley. The mist still clings to the mountains. The landscape looks much as it did a century ago, but something has changed. There is an awareness now, an acknowledgement. The town has embraced the memory of the murdered nuns rather than fleeing from it. The local parish church holds a monthly mass in their honor. The primary school teaches children about the massacre as part of local history lessons. The tourist office includes the memorial on its heritage trail, contextualizing it within the broader story of the Civil War and its aftermath. This remembering is not comfortable. It forces confrontation with difficult questions about heroism and villainy, about when resistance becomes atrocity, about how communities process trauma and guilt. But it is necessary, because the alternative, erasure, silence, forgetting, is worse. Dr. Siobhan O'Malley, the historian who brought the massacre to public attention, wrote in her book, Silenced Voices, Hidden Atrocities of the Irish Civil War, 2005. We honor the dead not by sanitizing their stories, but by telling the full truth of their lives and deaths. The 13 nuns of Our Lady of Sorrows did not die for Irish freedom, nor did they die for British oppression. They died because they stood between power and its preservation, between violence and its concealment. They died because one man chose his reputation over their lives, and because a government chose political expediency over justice. To remember them accurately is to acknowledge that history is not made only by heroes and villains, but by ordinary people trapped in extraordinary circumstances, and by the choices, both courageous and cowardly, that shape what stories survive to be told. Among the descendants of the murdered nuns, the process of healing has been long and incomplete. Some families speak openly about their ancestors, participating in commemorations and sharing photographs and letters. Others prefer privacy, finding the constant public examination of their family trauma exhausting and exploitative. A few remain angry, not just at Tom Moynihan, who is beyond earthly judgment, but at the state that betrayed their grandmothers and great-aunts, at the church that chose institutional protection over pastoral care, at the historians and journalists who profit from telling a story that cost their families so dearly. Margaret O'Sullivan, the great-niece of Sister Bernadette Moynihan, was interviewed in 2008 for a documentary about the massacre. She was 73 years old, a retired teacher living in Cork City. She said, "My grandmother, Bernadette's older sister, never spoke about it. Not once in 50 years. We knew she had a sister who was a nun, and we knew something terrible had happened, but the subject was forbidden. It was only after my grandmother died in 1994 that I found letters in her attic. Letters from Bernadette describing life in the convent, describing her fear of what her brother was doing, describing her guilt at being unable to stop him. In one of the last letters, dated just weeks before the massacre, Bernadette wrote, "I am caught between two loves, love of family and love of God. If I betray Thomas to protect the Mother Superior and the others, I betray blood. If I stay silent, I betray my vows. There is no path that does not lead to sin." When I read that, I wept for her. She was 25 years old. Just a girl, really. And she died knowing that her own brother had murdered her sisters in Christ, had murdered her. How do you live with that knowledge? How do you die with it? The question resonates beyond this single case. How do we live with the knowledge of what humans do to each other? How do we reconcile the capacity for devotion and sacrifice with the capacity for cruelty and erasure? How do we tell stories about the past that honor complexity without descending into moral relativism? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They have practical implications for how societies process historical trauma, how they teach history to younger generations, how they decide which monuments to build and which to tear down, which names to celebrate and which to condemn. In Ireland, the debate continues. Tom Moynihan's name still appears on memorials to IRA volunteers. His grave is maintained by Republican organizations. Some argue that his involvement in the massacre, even if proven beyond doubt, doesn't erase his earlier contributions to independence, that historical figures should not be judged solely by their worst acts. Others insist that participating in the murder of 13 nuns disqualifies him from any honor, that commemorating him is an insult to his victims and their families. There is no easy resolution. History resists neat categorization. People are capable of both heroism and horror, sometimes simultaneously, sometimes sequentially. The same man who risks his life for his country's freedom might also murder innocent women to protect his secrets. The same government that fights for self-determination might also suppress truth to maintain power. The same church that provides spiritual comfort might also prioritize institutional survival over justice. Understanding these contradictions doesn't mean excusing them. It means acknowledging that moral clarity is often harder to achieve than we'd like to admit, that the past is more complicated than heritage plaques suggest, that remembering accurately is more important than remembering comfortably. The story of the Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows remains a disturbing reminder that some horrors are committed not in darkness but in silence, not hidden from view in the moment of their occurrence, but erased afterward through systematic suppression of evidence and intimidation of witnesses. The massacre happened in February 1923, witnessed by soldiers, known to government officials, documented in contemporaneous records. It wasn't concealed because no one knew about it. It was concealed because those in power decided that knowing about it was inconvenient. This distinction matters. It means that the primary injustice wasn't the inability to prevent the massacre. Civil war creates conditions where atrocities become tragically common, but the deliberate choice to deny it happened, to silence those who tried to speak truth, to allow the perpetrator to live and die honored while the victims were forgotten. But questions remain. Mysteries that may never be fully resolved. What happened to the bodies found in the crypt beneath the convent? The official commission report mentioned them briefly, confirming that 5 bodies were discovered and identified, but provided no details about their burial or any investigation into their deaths. Were there more bodies that were never found? How many men died in that chamber, tortured for information or executed as informers? Their families left to wonder what became of them. What became of Blackbird, the informer who provided the initial intelligence that led to the raid? Hegarty's diary mentions him, but provides no identifying details. Was he a genuine intelligence asset, or was he manipulated by Moynihan, fed information designed to trigger the raid at a specific time, after the weapons had been removed and the massacre completed, ensuring that Free State forces would discover the bodies and be implicated in the scandal? If so, did Blackbird know he was being used? Or was he an unwitting pawn in a more complex game? And what of the other soldiers who accompanied Hegarty that morning? The diary names them, Lynch, McCarthy, and 9 others. But what happened to them? Were they all successfully silenced, or did some of them try to tell the story? Did any of them, in old age, confess what they had seen to their children or grandchildren? Are there other accounts waiting to be discovered in attics and archives? The Commission for Historical Investigation identified all 13 nuns and provided biographical information about each one. But one detail stands out. Sister Agnes Fitzgerald, age 34, entered the convent in 1918 after her fiancé was killed in the Great War. According to church records, she was initially rejected by the Carmelites because of concerns about her psychological state. She had attempted suicide after her fiancé's death. But Mother Superior Mary Columbanus personally intervened, arguing that the convent could provide the healing and structure that Sister Agnes needed. In the chapel on that February morning, Sister Agnes was found not with the others arranged before the altar, but apart, in a small side chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary. Her body was positioned differently, not kneeling or prostrate, but seated against the wall, as if she had retreated there seeking sanctuary within the sanctuary. Her hands clutched a photograph, water-damaged and difficult to identify in the forensic photographs, but family members confirmed it was a picture of her fiancé, still carried 5 years after his death. What was Sister Agnes thinking in those final moments? Did she understand what was happening? Did she pray for her fiancé, for herself, for the man or men pulling the trigger? Did she find in those last seconds the peace that had eluded her in life? We cannot know. The dead keep their final thoughts secret. But her story, like the stories of her 12 sisters, deserves to be told, remembered, honored, not as abstract symbols or political talking points, but as individual lives cut short, as futures erased, as possibilities never realized. The memorial in Ballyvorney attempts to capture this individuality. Each of the 13 plaques provides not just a name and dates, but a glimpse of personality. Sister Bernadette loved music and played the organ for morning prayers. Sister Catherine was known for her skill in the garden, cultivating roses in soil that shouldn't have supported them. Sister Mary Teresa had been a teacher before entering the convent and continued to tutor local children in reading and mathematics. Sister Margaret Bridget wrote poetry, fragments of which survive in letters to her family. These details matter. They resist the reduction of the victims to mere numbers, to tragic but faceless casualties of historical forces beyond their control. They insist that each woman was complex, unique, irreplaceable, not just a nun, not just a victim, but a person whose absence diminished the world. The story of the Ballyvourney Massacre remains a disturbing reminder that the greatest violence is often not the violence of the moment, but the violence of erasure, the systematic effort to make horrors vanish, to silence witnesses, to rewrite history in service of political or institutional preservation. 13 women died in that convent, but thousands more suffered the injustice of having those deaths denied, hidden, forgotten. But questions remain, whispers that haunt the hillsides of West Cork even now. Local residents still report strange phenomena around the site of the demolished convent. Unexplained lights in the early morning hours, the sound of women's voices singing psalms when no one is there, the scent of incense on the wind where no church stands. Skeptics dismiss these as psychological projections, the power of suggestion working on minds primed by knowledge of the tragedy. But the reports persist, consistent across decades and demographics, suggesting that some wounds in the landscape never fully heal. To this day, historians continue to uncover fragments of the suppressed story. In 2015, a sealed file was discovered in Vatican archives containing correspondence between the Bishop of Cork and Rome in 1923. The letters reveal that the bishop urgently requested guidance on how to handle an unprecedented atrocity involving women religious, and that Vatican officials advised complete silence to prevent scandal and protect the Church's moral authority. During this critical period for Irish Catholicism, the revelation that the cover-up extended to the highest levels of the church hierarchy added another layer of betrayal to an already tragic story. And on silent nights in Ballyvourney, when the mist hangs thick in the valley and the Soulain River runs dark beneath a moonless sky, people still report seeing figures on the hillside where the convent once stood, 13 shapes in gray habits, walking in single file toward where the chapel used to be, their forms translucent in the darkness, their faces turned toward heaven or toward judgment. The residents don't speak of these sightings loudly. They mention them quietly, in pubs after a few drinks, or to trusted friends who won't mock or disbelieve. They say that the nuns are still there, still praying, still keeping their vigil, waiting not for vengeance but for acknowledgement, for the full truth to be told, for justice not just in earthly courts but in the court of memory and conscience. Whether these visions are genuine hauntings or psychological manifestations of collective guilt, they speak to a truth, that the murdered women refuse to remain erased, that their story demands to be told and retold, that silence is no longer an option. If this journey through one of Ireland's darkest and most suppressed chapters has moved you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of historical truth and institutional betrayal, if you recognize that some stories resist comfortable resolution, then consider subscribing to this channel. There are many more mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined, not for sensationalism, but for understanding, not to judge the past from a position of moral superiority, but to learn how easily truth can be sacrificed to convenience, how readily institutions protect themselves at the expense of victims, how crucial it is to remember what powerful forces would prefer we forget. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your thoughts on how societies should balance honoring historical heroes with acknowledging their crimes, how we preserve memory when official records have been destroyed, how we live with the knowledge that justice often arrives too late or not at all. The 13 nuns of Our Lady of Sorrows cannot speak for themselves anymore, but their silence demands that we speak for them, that we refuse to let their deaths be erased again, that we insist on remembering accurately even when remembering is painful. Until next time, may we all have the courage to face uncomfortable truths, the wisdom to understand complexity without excusing evil, and the integrity to tell stories that need telling even when they disturb our cherished narratives. But the story does not end with memorial plaques and annual commemorations. Like all profound tragedies, the Ballyvourney Massacre cast shadows that stretched far beyond that February morning in 1923. Shadows that touched lives in ways that would not become apparent for decades. Shadows that revealed connections between seemingly unrelated events across the span of the 20th century. In 2009, A remarkable discovery added new dimensions to our understanding of what happened at the Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows. An elderly woman named Kathleen Brennan, living in a nursing home in Boston, Massachusetts, contacted the Irish consulate with an urgent request. She was 94 years old and dying of cancer. Before she passed, she said, she needed to confess something, not to a priest, but to history. She had information about Ballyverney that no one else possessed. Information that had haunted her for 86 years. Information that would die with her unless someone listened. Dr. Siobhan O'Malley, by then a professor emeritus and recognized authority on the Civil War period, flew to Boston to interview Mrs. Brennan. What she learned would require the reopening of the Historical Commission's investigation and would challenge some of the conclusions. That had seemed definitive. Kathleen Brennan had been born Kathleen Murphy in Ballyverney in 1915. Her father, Sean Murphy, had been a grocer in the town, a man who tried to remain neutral in the Civil War, selling goods to Free State soldiers and Republicans alike, understanding that survival in those times required accommodation rather than conviction. But neutrality, Kathleen explained, was an illusion. Everyone was implicated. Everyone knew more than they admitted. Everyone carried secrets that corroded them from within. In February 1923, Kathleen had been 7 years old, living with her family in a house that overlooked the road leading to the convent. On the night of February 18th, the night before Captain Hegarty's raid discovered the bodies, young Kathleen had been unable to sleep. She suffered from chronic earaches, and that particular night the pain had been especially severe. She had gone to the window, pressing her hot face against the cold glass, seeking relief, and she had seen something. It was perhaps 2 in the morning, Mrs. Brennan told Dr. O'Malley, her voice thin but steady, her Boston accent barely concealing the Cork lilt underneath. The moon was nearly full and the road was visible even in darkness. I saw them, a group of men, perhaps 10 or 12, moving up the road toward the convent. They carried rifles. They moved with purpose, not like men sneaking, but like men with authority, with right on their side, at least in their own minds. She paused, accepting water from a nurse, her hands trembling with age and illness. I recognized one of them. Tom Moynihan. Everyone knew Tom. He was a hero to most, a monster to some, but always unmistakable. Tall, with that distinctive limp from a wound he'd taken at Kilmichael. But there was another man with him, walking slightly ahead, and this man I didn't recognize. He wore a Free State uniform. Dr. O'Malley leaned forward. A Free State soldier. Are you certain? As certain as I am of my own name. I was 7, but I wasn't stupid. I knew the uniforms. The Free State forces had occupied the town for months. This man wore their khaki uniform, their distinctive cap. He was with Moynihan's group, not as a prisoner, but as a collaborator. They were talking together, pointing toward the convent, planning something. This testimony was explosive. The official narrative, the one that had emerged from the 2003 commission and been accepted by historians, held that Tom Moynihan and his anti-treaty forces had carried out the massacre alone, acting to conceal their use of the convent as an execution site and to eliminate the Mother Superior who had betrayed them. But if a Free State soldier had been part of the group that night, it suggested something far more disturbing. Collaboration between supposedly opposing forces, a conspiracy that crossed battle lines. Mrs. Brennan continued, I watched them enter the convent grounds. I wanted to wake my father, but I was frightened. And perhaps I already understood, even at 7, that knowing certain things was dangerous, that speaking about what you'd seen could get you killed. So I stayed at the window watching, waiting. She described hearing perhaps 20 minutes later, the sound of gunfire, not the rapid, chaotic shooting of combat, but measured, deliberate shots, executed in sequence. Pop, 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 methodical, professional, horrible. I counted 13 shots, she said. I remember thinking even then that it was the same number as Christ and his apostles. 13. It seemed significant, though I couldn't have said why. Later, when I learned there had been 13 nuns, I understood. 1 bullet for each. But Mrs. Brennan's most disturbing revelation concerned what happened after the shooting stopped. She saw the men emerge from the convent perhaps an hour later. But now there were only 8 or 9 of them. Several members of the group had remained inside or left by another route. And crucially, Tom Moynihan was no longer with them. The Free State soldier was now clearly in charge, directing the others, issuing orders that Mrs. Brennan couldn't hear, but could see obeyed. The group dispersed into the darkness, moving quickly back down the road and then splitting apart, vanishing into the network of lanes and paths that crisscrossed the valley. "I never told anyone," Mrs. Brennan said, tears now flowing down her deeply lined face. "Not my father, not my mother, not the priests who came asking questions later. I was 7 years old, and I had watched men commit murder, and I understood that speaking about it would endanger my family. So I kept silent. I kept silent when I emigrated to Boston in 1929. I kept silent through marriage, children, grandchildren. I kept silent for 86 years. She gripped Dr. O'Malley's hand with surprising strength. But I can't stay silent anymore. Those women deserve the truth, the full truth, not the sanitized version that makes everyone feel comfortable." There was collaboration. Free State and Republican forces worked together that night. They murdered those nuns together, and then they created a lie where Moynihan was the sole villain, where the Free State forces were innocent discoverers of a crime rather than participants in it. Dr. O'Malley spent 3 days in Boston, recording Mrs. Brennan's testimony, asking detailed questions, testing her memory and consistency. She was cautious. Elderly witnesses can be unreliable, their memories contaminated by decades of subsequent information, their need for significance distorting actual events. But Mrs. Brennan's account was remarkably specific and consistent. She described details about the night, the phase of the moon, the temperature, the distinctive sound of the Solane River in winter that checked out. She described the Free State uniform with accuracy that suggested genuine observation rather than constructed memory. Most convincingly, she had no apparent motive to lie. She was dying, had nothing to gain from the controversy her testimony would create, and seemed genuinely tormented by her decades of silence. Kathleen Brennan died 3 weeks after Dr. O'Malley's visit. Her testimony was published posthumously in 2010, along with Dr. O'Malley's careful analysis and contextual research. The implications were staggering. If Mrs. Brennan was accurate, if Free State forces had participated in the massacre, then the entire official narrative required reconsideration. The cover-up hadn't been merely about protecting political image or avoiding scandal. It had been about concealing direct involvement in mass murder, about hiding evidence that would have implicated the government not just in suppression of truth but in the original crime. Dr. O'Malley's research uncovered supporting evidence. She discovered that Captain Daniel Hegarty, in the weeks before his forced discharge in 1923, had written a letter to his brother, a letter that the brother had kept hidden for decades, only bringing it forward after reading about Mrs. Brennan's testimony. In that letter, Hegarty wrote, "I am being pushed out because I know too much, because I asked questions that were not welcome. The massacre was not what we were told. There are connections, collaborations that reach higher than anyone admits. I discovered something in the convent that I was ordered never to speak about, evidence that some of my own superiors were involved, that the raid was orchestrated not to stop Moynihan but to facilitate him, to provide cover for a crime that served purposes I don't fully understand. They are making me the scapegoat now, the traumatized soldier whose testimony is unreliable. But I know what I saw. I know what I was ordered to destroy." The letter was authenticated. The paper, ink, and handwriting were consistent with Hegarty's other correspondence from that period. It provided documentary support for Mrs. Brennan's eyewitness account. But if Free State forces had collaborated with Tom Moynihan, what was the motive? Why would opposing sides in a civil war work together to murder 13 nuns? The answer, Dr. O'Malley concluded, lay in understanding what the convent of Our Lady of Sorrows actually represented in February 1923. Through painstaking research, she discovered that Mother Superior Mary Columbanus had not merely been an informer about weapons caches. She had been documenting something far more dangerous: systematic corruption within both the anti-treaty IRA and the Free State forces. Among the papers sealed in church archives, Dr. O'Malley found copies of letters that Mother Superior had written but never sent, drafts that revealed her growing awareness of a criminal network that transcended political allegiances. The convent, she had discovered, was being used not just by Tom Moynihan for storing weapons and executing prisoners, but by Free State officers for black market operations. The Civil War had created opportunities for profit, Weapons could be stolen and sold, supplies diverted and resold, smuggling operations conducted under cover of military necessity. Some officers on both sides had discovered that they could make more money through illicit cooperation than through ideological conflict. Mother Superior's unsent letters described discovering crates marked as religious supplies that actually contained contraband, tobacco, alcohol, medical morphine, even jewelry and artwork that had been looted from estates during the fighting. She described overhearing conversations between her sister Bernadette and Tom Moynihan that revealed not just military planning but business arrangements, profit-sharing agreements, coordination with the men in khaki, who were supposed to be their enemies. She had been preparing to expose not just an IRA operation, but a corruption network that would have destroyed careers, led to courts-martial and executions, brought down senior figures on both sides of the Civil War. That's why she had to die. That's why all 13 nuns had to die, because any of them might have seen or heard too much, might have been able to corroborate the Mother Superior's allegations. The massacre was not primarily about vengeance or covering up a torture chamber. It was about protecting a criminal enterprise worth thousands of pounds, about preserving the power and freedom of men who had found common cause in greed, even as they supposedly fought for opposing ideologies. And Captain Hegarty's raid had been orchestrated precisely to occur after the massacre, to arrive just in time to discover the bodies and the horror, but too late to prevent it, too late to arrest anyone, too late to do anything except participate in the cover-up that powerful forces on both sides demanded. Hegarty himself had likely been chosen because he was honest, because his shock and trauma would be genuine, because his subsequent attempts to expose the truth would be easily discredited as the ravings of a soldier broken by what he'd witnessed. The conspiracy was elegant in its brutality. Both sides benefited from suppressing the truth. The Free State government avoided scandal about corruption within its ranks. The anti-treaty IRA avoided exposure of their complicity with the enemy they claimed to oppose. Tom Moynihan became the convenient villain, already dead by the time the truth began to emerge, unable to defend himself or implicate others, a perfect scapegoat whose guilt was real enough to be credible but incomplete enough to protect the wider network. This revised understanding of the Ballyvourney Massacre was published by Dr. O'Malley in her 2011 book, Beyond Betrayal, Corruption and Collaboration in Civil War Ireland. The book was controversial, attacked by nationalist historians who saw it as besmirching the reputation of independence heroes, and by government officials who argued that reopening old wounds served no constructive purpose. But families of the victims found validation in the new research. It explained why the cover-up had been so thorough, so persistent, so protected at the highest levels. It wasn't just about political embarrassment. It was about protecting criminals who held positions of authority, who had the power to silence witnesses and destroy evidence, who had everything to lose if the full truth emerged. The revelations sparked renewed investigation by the Irish government. In 2012, a new commission was established, this one with broader mandate and access to previously sealed military and intelligence files. What they uncovered over 3 years of investigation painted a picture of Civil War Ireland that was far more complex and morally ambiguous than traditional narratives allowed. They documented at least 15 other instances of collaboration between supposedly opposing forces for criminal purposes, arms dealing, extortion, smuggling, even coordinated assassinations of individuals who threatened to expose corruption. The Civil War, they concluded, had provided cover not just for ideological violence, but for organized crime that enriched participants on both sides. Several prominent figures from the independence era were posthumously implicated. Streets were renamed, monuments were reconsidered. The process was painful and divisive, with some arguing that historical figures should be judged by the standards of their time, others insisting that murder and corruption transcend historical context. But perhaps the most significant outcome of the investigation was the discovery of what happened to Tom Moynihan after 1923. Researchers uncovered bank records showing that Moynihan, who supposedly lived as a modest farmer after the Civil War, had actually accumulated substantial wealth. He owned property in Cork City, had investments in shipping and construction, traveled regularly to England and France on business. His prosperity was inconsistent with his claimed income and suggested continued involvement in illicit activities. More disturbing were documents indicating that Moynihan had maintained contact with certain Free State officers throughout the 1920s and 1930s, the same officers who had been part of the corruption network operating during the Civil War. These relationships persisted long after the fighting ended, suggesting that the criminal collaboration that had motivated the Convent massacre continued for years, evolving from wartime black market operations into peacetime organized crime. In other words, Tom Moynihan had not been punished for the massacre not because of a political cover-up alone, but because he had protection from former enemies who were now criminal partners, who had as much interest in his silence as he had in theirs, who ensured that he lived comfortably and unmolested as long as he kept their secrets. The investigation also revealed what happened to Blackbird, the mysterious informer whose intelligence had triggered Hegarty's raid. Through cross-referencing coded references in military documents, investigators concluded that Blackbird had likely been a Free State intelligence officer named Patrick Brennan, no relation to Kathleen Brennan, though both came from Ballyvorney. Lieutenant Brennan had been part of the corruption network, and his intelligence about weapons in the convent had been deliberately timed and crafted to ensure that the raid occurred after the massacre, giving the killers time to escape and creating the appearance of a Republican atrocity discovered by honorable Free State forces. Brennan himself had disappeared in 1924, officially reported as having emigrated to Canada, but investigators found records suggesting he had actually been killed, murdered in Dublin under circumstances that were never properly investigated. The likely explanation: he had become a liability, someone who knew too much, whose continued existence threatened the conspiracy of silence. His death was made to look like a random street crime, one more casualty of post-Civil War violence that no one examined too closely. The bodies kept piling up, year after year, decade after decade, not just the obvious victims like the 13 nuns, but the secondary victims, the witnesses and accomplices who became inconvenient, who were eliminated quietly to maintain the secret. Today, more than a century after the massacre, Ballyvorney continues to grapple with its dark history. The memorial has been expanded to include not just the 13 nuns, but all the victims of Civil War corruption, a recognition that the violence of that era extended beyond battlefield casualties to include those murdered for profit, for silence, for the preservation of power. The town hosts an annual Truth and Reconciliation Symposium where historians, activists, and descendants of people involved on all sides gather to discuss how communities process difficult histories. It's uncomfortable work. Descendants of men who were celebrated as heroes must confront evidence of their ancestors' crimes. Families who believe themselves connected to a noble struggle must reconcile that belief with the reality of corruption and collaboration. But there is value in discomfort, in refusing easy narratives and acknowledging that history is not a morality play with clear heroes and villains, but a complex web of choices made by flawed humans in impossible circumstances. The Convent of Our Lady of Sorrows stands now only in memory and memorial, but the questions it raises remain urgently relevant. How do societies balance honoring sacrifice with acknowledging crime? How do we tell stories about the past that recognize complexity without collapsing into cynicism? How do we remember victims whose deaths were deliberately erased, whose stories were suppressed by those in power? And perhaps most importantly, how many other massacres, other atrocities, other betrayals remain hidden in our histories, protected by institutional power, concealed by layers of cover-up, waiting for some determined researcher or dying witness to bring them into light? The full truth of Ballyvorney took 80 years to emerge, and even now questions remain. How many other truths are still buried, still waiting, still demanding the courage to speak and the willingness to listen? The dead cannot tell their stories, but they can haunt us until we tell those stories for them, accurately, completely, honestly, without the comfortable lies that institutions prefer. The 13 nuns of Our Lady of Sorrows deserved better than they received in life. The least we can offer them in death is truth, difficult, uncomfortable, complicated truth that challenges our myths and forces us to confront the full reality of what happened in that valley, in that building, on that cold February morning when murder wore the mask of necessity and silence became complicity. Their memory demands nothing less, and until every truth is told, until every secret is exposed, until every grave gives up its story, the work of remembering, real remembering, honest remembering continues. This has been the Untold Hour.